Every empire in history has believed it was different, that its power was permanent, that the economic laws that destroyed previous civilizations somehow didn't apply to them because of their military strength, their cultural sophistication, or their conviction that they'd learned from others' mistakes. The Romans believed their empire would last forever, backed by legions that had never lost a major war and engineering that built monuments still standing 2,000 years later. The Spanish believed their American silver mines gave them infinite wealth that could finance any ambition. The British believed their navy's dominance and their empire spanning a quarter of the globe made them invulnerable. And every single one collapsed, not primarily through military defeat by foreign armies, though that often delivered the final blow, but through fiscal exhaustion driven by debt accumulated during decades or centuries of imperial overextension. Understanding how empires collapse under debt means recognizing a pattern that has repeated across 3,000 years of recorded history. Empires expand beyond their economic means, finance that expansion through borrowing or currency debasement, reach a tipping point where debt service consumes revenues that should defend or administer the empire, lose the ability to respond to crises or defend against enemies, and collapse militarily, economically, and politically in cascades that can unfold across generations or sometimes in mere decades. The pattern is so consistent it's almost a law of history, and every indicator suggests the American empire is following the same trajectory at the same stage where fiscal exhaustion precedes collapse, accumulating debt at rates that make Rome's currency debasement look restrained, maintaining global military commitments that cost more annually than the entire GDP of most nations, and displaying the political dysfunction and unwillingness to make hard choices that characterizes every empire in its final decades. History doesn't repeat, but the debt dynamics that destroyed previous empires are operating now with the same mathematical certainty they've always had. And understanding those dynamics is the only way to see what's coming and position yourself before the collapse that most people won't recognize until it's already happened. The Roman Empire provides the foundational case study because its collapse was so extensively documented and because the fiscal mechanisms that destroyed it are recognizable today. Rome at its height under the Antonine emperors in the 2nd century AD controlled the Mediterranean world, maintained standing armies across 3 continents, built infrastructure that modern engineers still admire, and enjoyed prosperity and relative peace unmatched in ancient history. The empire's gold aureus was the reserve currency of the ancient world, accepted from Britain to Persia, stable in weight and purity for centuries. But maintaining the empire was extraordinarily expensive. The legions required continuous payment in hard currency, not promises or devalued coins. Frontier defenses stretched thousands of miles from Scotland to Arabia, requiring permanent garrisons. Infrastructure from roads to aqueducts to amphitheaters demanded constant maintenance. And the Roman state provided subsidized grain to Rome's urban population, the famous bread and circuses that kept political stability but cost enormous sums. During the good centuries, tax revenues from a prosperous empire covered these costs. But by the 3rd century, the mathematics changed. Military pressure increased as Germanic tribes, Persians, and other enemies became more organized and aggressive. Rome needed more soldiers, which meant more expense. But the tax base was shrinking as plague, political instability, and economic disruption reduced population and commerce. The gap between spending and revenue grew, and Rome had no bond market where it could borrow trillions. Instead, they turned to currency debasement, the ancient equivalent of printing money. The silver denarius, Rome's standard currency, began the 3rd century at roughly 90% silver purity. By 268 AD, it was only 5% silver, the rest base metals covered with a thin silver coating that quickly wore off. This debasement was deliberate policy to finance government spending. By mixing base metals with silver while maintaining the coin's face value, the empire could produce more coins from the same amount of silver, effectively creating money from nothing. This allowed paying soldiers, building fortifications, and maintaining government operations despite revenues being insufficient. But debasement caused inflation exactly as modern money printing does. When people realized coins contained less silver, they demanded more coins for the same goods. Prices rose dramatically, wages couldn't keep pace, and economic calculation became impossible because the currency's value was constantly changing. The historian Lactantius described conditions by the early 4th century. There were more men receiving government payments than paying taxes, and the tax burden became so crushing it destroyed the productive economy. The attempt to control inflation through Diocletian's edict on maximum prices, essentially empire-wide price controls, failed because producers simply stopped selling at controlled prices, causing shortages. The fiscal death spiral is evident in Rome's final centuries. Debasement caused inflation that required more revenue to maintain the same real level of spending. Tax increases to raise that revenue destroyed the productive economy, reducing future tax capacity. Desperate for revenue, the state expanded the bureaucracy to enforce collections and prevent evasion, but bureaucrats needed to be paid, consuming more revenue. Defense costs continued rising as barbarian pressure increased and as debasement made it harder to recruit and retain soldiers who understood their pay was losing value. By the 5th century, the Western Empire couldn't afford to defend itself adequately, had lost control over its tax base as provinces seceded or were conquered, and was militarily so weak that Germanic tribes could sack Rome itself in 410 AD and depose the last emperor in 476 AD. The collapse wasn't sudden or total. The Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, survived another 1,000 years by maintaining fiscal discipline, refusing to debase its gold solidus, and keeping spending aligned with revenues. But the West collapsed under debt and fiscal mismanagement as directly as any empire before or since. And critically, the collapse didn't happen through a single catastrophic defeat. It was a slow erosion of military and economic capacity driven by fiscal exhaustion that left the empire unable to respond to multiple simultaneous threats. The Spanish Empire's collapse provides a later example with better documentation and mechanisms more recognizable to modern readers. Spain in the 16th century controlled the largest empire in history up to that point, ruling territories from Europe to the Americas to the Philippines. The discovery and conquest of the Americas brought unprecedented wealth, particularly silver from mines in Peru and Mexico that produced tons of precious metal annually flowing back to Spain. This wealth seemed to give Spain infinite resources to pursue any ambition. Spain used this wealth to fight nearly continuous wars defending Catholicism against Protestants, fighting the Ottomans, controlling the Netherlands, and maintaining the empire. The wars were staggeringly expensive, requiring massive armies and navies that consumed the American silver as quickly as it arrived. But the silver wasn't enough. Spain borrowed extensively, particularly from German and Italian bankers, pledging future silver shipments as collateral. When current revenues and borrowing weren't sufficient, Spain debased its copper currency, the vellon, mixing less valuable metals while maintaining face value. The result was predictable. Inflation destroyed the Spanish economy. Prices in Spain rose roughly 400% during the 16th century as American silver flooded in, an early case study in monetary inflation that the philosopher Jean Bodin recognized at the time. But the inflation from debasement was worse, causing copper coinage to lose most of its value. Meanwhile, the continuous wars drained wealth faster than mines could produce it. Spain defaulted on its debts repeatedly in 1557, 1560, 1575, 1596, 1607, 1627, 1647, and 1680, each time wiping out creditors and making future borrowing more expensive. The combination of inflation, defaults, and continuous war destroyed Spain's economy and eventually its empire. The Netherlands successfully rebelled, costing Spain one of its richest provinces. Military defeats accumulated as Spain couldn't afford to maintain the armies and navies that had once dominated Europe. By the 18th century, Spain was a second-rate power despite still controlling vast American territories because its fiscal exhaustion prevented it from converting colonial wealth into real power. The silver that was supposed to make Spain invincible instead financed its destruction through the inflation and debt it enabled. The pattern Spain demonstrated is critical. Natural resource wealth doesn't prevent fiscal collapse if spending consistently exceeds revenues. Commodity-rich empires and nations, from Spain to Venezuela to Saudi Arabia, often fall into the trap of spending future resource revenues today through borrowing, then facing crisis when revenues fall, debts come due, or the resources deplete. The resource curse, where resource wealth leads to corruption, economic distortion, and eventual collapse, is fundamentally a fiscal phenomenon where easy money enables unsustainable spending that destroys the productive economy. The British Empire's decline provides the most recent and best documented case of empire collapse through fiscal exhaustion. Britain in 1942 was the world's superpower, controlling a quarter of the globe's land and population, possessing the world's largest navy, and serving as the world's banker through the City of London. The pound sterling was the reserve currency, backed by gold, stable for a century under the classical gold standard. Britain seemed invincible, wealthy, and permanent. World War I shattered this position not through military defeat but through fiscal devastation. Fighting the war cost Britain roughly 40% of its national wealth. The government borrowed massively, both domestically and from the United States, running up debts that would take decades to service. More critically, Britain suspended gold convertibility to print money for war finance, destroying the monetary stability that had underpinned the pound's reserve status. After the war, Britain attempted to return to gold at the pre-war parity, but this required deflationary policies that caused massive unemployment and economic stagnation. The fiscal burden of debt service, combined with the costs of maintaining the empire, became unsustainable during the interwar period. Britain couldn't afford to both service its debts and maintain naval supremacy and colonial administration. The empire was costing more than it produced in value. When World War II arrived, Britain again borrowed massively, this time primarily from the United States under Lend-Lease. By 1945, Britain was effectively bankrupt, owing enormous debts, unable to maintain gold convertibility, and dependent on American financial support. The collapse of British power happened remarkably quickly after World War II. The empire was dismantled within 2 decades, not primarily through military defeats or anti-colonial rebellions, though those occurred, but because Britain couldn't afford to maintain it. The pound's reserve currency status ended through the 1950s and 1960s as Britain's fiscal position remained weak and as sterling crises repeatedly forced devaluations. The Suez Crisis of 1956 demonstrated the new reality. Britain attempted to assert power in Egypt, but American financial pressure, threatening to cause a sterling crisis if Britain didn't withdraw, forced humiliating retreat. Britain had lost the fiscal capacity to act independently, making it a junior partner to the United States rather than a superpower. The transition from British to American dominance was a direct transfer of power enabled by fiscal positions. Britain bankrupted by 2 world wars, America enriched by them. The Bretton Woods system established the dollar as reserve currency explicitly because the US had the gold reserves and fiscal strength Britain had lost. Britain's decline from superpower to mid-level European country happened in roughly 30 years, from 1945 to 1975, driven primarily by fiscal exhaustion that made maintaining empire impossible. The Soviet Union's collapse provides the most recent major example and demonstrates that the debt-driven fiscal exhaustion pattern applies to communist empires as well as capitalist ones. The Soviet Union didn't have formal government debt in Western terms, but it had massive hidden debt in the form of obligations to citizens through guaranteed employment, subsidized prices, and cradle-to-grave welfare, plus obligations to satellite states and client regimes worldwide that depended on Soviet subsidies. The Soviet economy was grossly inefficient, consuming far more resources to produce goods than market economies. But the system was sustained by oil exports during the 1970s when high energy prices generated hard currency. When oil prices collapsed in the mid-1980s, falling from nearly $40 per barrel to around $10, Soviet hard currency revenues crashed. This made it impossible to import food, technology, and consumer goods the economy couldn't produce domestically. The fiscal position became untenable. Gorbachev's reforms, glasnost, and perestroika were attempts to revitalize the economy without abandoning socialism. They failed because the fundamental fiscal mathematics were impossible. The Soviet economy couldn't generate enough output to maintain living standards, military spending, and empire simultaneously. Something had to give. The empire collapsed first, with Eastern European satellites breaking free in 1989-1991 as the Soviet Union couldn't afford to maintain military control. Then the Soviet Union itself dissolved in 1991 as constituent republics declared independence rather than continue subsidizing Russia's imperial pretensions. The fiscal mechanics of Soviet collapse are instructive. Hidden debt in the form of unfunded promises, resource dependence creating vulnerability to commodity price collapses, and military spending consuming resources needed for civilian economy. These same dynamics threaten current empires and superpowers, particularly the United States with its vast unfunded entitlement obligations, its economy's dependence on imported energy and goods, and its military spending exceeding the next 10 countries combined. The common patterns across all these historical collapses are remarkably consistent. Imperial overextension. Every collapsing empire expanded beyond the economic capacity to sustain its commitments. Rome tried to defend the entire Mediterranean world. Spain fought simultaneous wars across Europe. Britain maintained a global empire. The Soviet Union subsidized client states worldwide. And America maintains hundreds of military bases globally, fights multiple wars simultaneously, and attempts to police the world while also funding enormous domestic entitlement programs. The commitments exceed resources, creating the debt trap. Currency debasement or excessive borrowing. When revenues can't cover spending, empires either debase currency, which is what Rome did, or borrow extensively, which is what Britain and America did. Both mechanisms allow spending beyond means temporarily but create future obligations that compound and eventually become unpayable. Modern fiat currency systems allow debasement through money printing rather than mixing base metals into coins, but the effect is identical: inflation that destroys savings and eventually confidence in the currency. Collapse of productive economy. The taxes or inflation needed to service debt destroy the productive private economy. Rome's tax burden by the 4th century was so crushing that people abandoned land rather than pay. Spain's inflation and financial chaos destroyed its manufacturing and agriculture. Britain's interwar deflation to maintain gold parity caused mass unemployment. The Soviet economy was inherently unproductive, but military spending made it worse. And America's debt service costs are now consuming resources that could otherwise be invested productively, while inflation destroys savings and distorts economic calculation. Loss of military capacity. As fiscal capacity erodes, military spending becomes unsustainable but can't be cut without inviting attack or rebellion. Rome couldn't afford adequate legions to defend all frontiers. Spain couldn't maintain its armies in the Netherlands and throughout Europe. Britain couldn't afford to maintain its navy's global dominance. The Soviet Union couldn't afford to keep military control over Eastern Europe. And America faces choices between maintaining global commitments and fiscal stability, with political paralysis preventing either path from being fully pursued. Political dysfunction preventing reform. Every collapsing empire reaches a point where the reforms needed to restore fiscal stability become politically impossible. Roman emperors who attempted tax reform or military spending cuts faced rebellion. Spanish kings defaulted rather than cut spending on wars. British governments couldn't implement the austerity needed to maintain gold convertibility without causing riots. Soviet leaders couldn't abandon communism without losing power. And American politicians can't cut entitlements or raise taxes without electoral defeat, creating gridlock where everyone knows what needs to happen but no one will do it. Rapid collapse after extended decline. The actual collapse happens much faster than the decline leading up to it. Rome declined for 2 centuries, but the final collapse of the West was relatively sudden. Spain remained powerful for a century while declining, but lost its great power status quickly in the mid-17th century. Britain declined between the wars but gave up its empire in 20 years after 1945. The Soviet Union appeared stable until suddenly collapsing in 2 years. The pattern suggests long, slow fiscal erosion followed by sudden political and military collapse once tipping points are crossed. The implications for the American empire are ominous. By every metric that preceded historical collapses, the U.S. is at similar or worse stages. Federal debt exceeds 100% of GDP, a level reached historically only during World War II. Debt service costs approach $1 trillion annually and are accelerating. Military commitments span the globe, with troops stationed in dozens of countries and conflicts ongoing or threatened in multiple regions simultaneously. The political system is dysfunctional to the point where basic governance, like passing budgets, becomes crisis-prone. And reforms that would address fiscal problems, cutting entitlements, or raising taxes substantially are politically impossible given current alignments. The historical timeline suggests the American empire has perhaps 1 to 3 decades before fiscal exhaustion forces dramatic retrenchment, loss of reserve currency status, or actual collapse. Rome's Western Empire took about 2 centuries from peak to collapse. Spain took about a century. Britain took 30 years from 1945 to loss of empire. The Soviet Union took about a decade from apparent stability to dissolution. America has been in relative decline since roughly 2000, about 25 years. The acceleration suggests crisis within the next decade rather than decades, particularly given the exponential nature of debt compounding and the speed of modern financial markets. The defense often heard is that America is different, that its military supremacy is so overwhelming that fiscal problems don't matter, or that the dollar's reserve status gives it perpetual ability to borrow cheaply regardless of debt levels, but every empire believed it was different. Rome believed its military was invincible until it wasn't. Spain believed American silver gave it infinite wealth until it didn't. Britain believed its navy made it invincible until fiscal exhaustion forced retrenchment. The Soviet Union believed communist planning was superior until it collapsed. And America believes its financial system sophistication and military technology make it immune to the fiscal mathematics that destroyed every previous empire. The preparations individuals can take are similar to those for any imperial collapse: reducing dependence on empire benefits that will disappear, diversifying wealth internationally. So imperial collapse doesn't destroy all assets, developing skills and connections that retain value in post-imperial reality, and understanding that imperial collapse doesn't necessarily mean personal disaster if you're positioned correctly. The fall of the British Empire impoverished Britain's working and middle classes who'd benefited from imperial trade and jobs, but the wealthy who'd diversified internationally often prospered in the new American-dominated order. The question isn't whether America will collapse under debt. History suggests it will because no empire has ever sustained debt levels above 100% of GDP indefinitely, and America's is rising rather than stabilizing. The questions are when, how quickly, what form the collapse takes, and whether it's managed relatively gracefully like Britain's transition to junior partner status, or catastrophically like Rome's dissolution or the Soviet collapse. And critically, whether you'll recognize the signs while there's time to prepare, or whether you'll trust in American exceptionalism until the day the empire can't pay its bills, can't maintain its military, can't defend its interests, and collapses under debt that everyone knew was unsustainable but assumed somehow wouldn't matter because this time was different. The mathematics that destroyed Rome, Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union aren't suspended for America. The debt is compounding, the interest is consuming ever more resources, the military commitments are unsustainable, the political system is gridlocked, and the fiscal trajectory points inexorably toward crisis. History doesn't repeat exactly, but the patterns are clear enough. Empires that accumulate unsustainable debt eventually collapse under that debt. America is accumulating debt faster than any empire in history. The collapse is coming. The only question is whether you'll see it soon enough to position yourself safely, or whether you'll learn too late that empires built on debt always, eventually collapse under that debt, and that your empire, your prosperity, your assumptions about permanent American dominance were never different, never exempt, never safe from the historical forces that have destroyed every empire that tried to sustain itself through borrowing from the future when the future arrives and demands payment that can't be made. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. Every empire falls, every single one. They all believed they were different, that their military or resources or sophistication made them immune to fiscal mathematics. And every single one collapsed when debt became unpayable, when interest consumed revenues, when the productive economy couldn't sustain both debt service and empire maintenance. Rome fell, Spain fell, Britain fell, the Soviets fell, and America is following the exact same trajectory, accumulating the exact same unsustainable debt, displaying the exact same political dysfunction, and heading toward the exact same collapse that history proves is inevitable when empires spend decades living beyond their means through debt that compounds until the day it can't be sustained anymore and the empire that seemed eternal reveals itself to have been temporary all along. Just one more example of the pattern that repeats across millennia, showing that empires rise through fiscal discipline and military strength, but collapse under debt that destroys both, leaving ruins and warnings that the next empire, your empire, will ignore just as completely until the day the collapse arrives and everyone realizes too late that the warnings were right, the mathematics were certain, and the fall was inevitable the moment the debt began compounding faster than the capacity to repay it.